And now the view from the other side, from perhaps the one and only reasonable bucknut, at least that we know. Our good friend Mark Rogers himself has a fantastic college football channel covering the entire sport right here on YouTube. Mark Rogers, the voice of college football. Good to see you again, my friend. How are you?
Good to see you, Steve. I am loving this Big Ten race. It should be intriguing.
Indeed. We've got the first game between top 5 teams in the Big Ten that does not include Michigan or Ohio State since 1962. This is the first time Iowa has played in a game between two top 5 teams since their number 1 versus number 2 game against Michigan in 1985. So, and James Franklin, by the way, has the same awful record on the road against ranked teams Jim Harbaugh does. But just for some odd reason, no one ever mentions it or talks about it, probably because he beat Ohio State once. And so therefore he has a papal dispensation against all the criticism that Jimmy gets. But that notwithstanding, that should be a fun game this weekend. But let's get to your thoughts on where the Wolverines are. I laid out a few things at the top of the show. The aggression, the innovation, these are sorts of things that many a Michigan message board, many a Michigan blog, many a Michigan podcast and radio show for many, many moons now have kvetched about. And suddenly the Wolverines just decided to lay it all out there with all kinds of aggression and innovation. As a result, they got their first win in Madison in 20 years. One of the more impressive wins of the Harbaugh era. Probably knocked Wisconsin out, and you had to know the Badgers went into that game kind of really desperate, knowing they couldn't afford a loss. So your impressions now we both agreed after the non-conference that Michigan's floor was raised, right? We both agreed on that, okay? So now I think we're having a conversation about what's the ceiling. I still want to see Saturday night in Lincoln, Nebraska, because I still don't fully trust my team wearing white uniforms quite yet. And I might be more willing to have that ceiling conversation next week heading into that bye. But where are you at?
I'm in a different place than a lot of college football fans that respond to my channel, at least, who aren't impressed by many wins in the country. And then I point out to them statistically that there are very few wins against the type teams that most people are impressed by. So despite the 1-3 record, despite the struggling offense, that includes, surprisingly, the offensive line for Wisconsin is really bad right now. And Graham Mertz obviously having his ups and downs, although he gave us that brief glimpse of greatness at the end of the first half where he made 2 remarkable throws, that I had a checklist of items that I was looking at this Michigan football team, and most of those were checked off. So first and foremost, can Michigan run the football after what we saw in the second half against Rutgers? Can they do it against a quality defense? Well, yes and no. They weren't stopped stone cold by this Wisconsin defense like the Badgers did to Penn State, like the Badgers did against Notre Dame. They ran it fairly effectively. Of course, didn't have anywhere near the success that they've had the rest of the season, but this Wisconsin defense is still a top-notch unit. So they ran it effectively enough. But when they couldn't run the ball, yes, they turned to the passing game. They turned to the passing game for explosive, dynamic plays. And that was an effective performance by Cade McNamara. And, oh, yeah, that first series of the second half given to J.J. McCarthy, he explodes with a 56-yard touchdown pass. So when you throw for 260 yards and 3 touchdowns with no turnovers out of the passing game, that's an effective performance. You mentioned the road woes of this program under Jim Harbaugh, and even with Wisconsin struggling, that's a difficult place to play against a top-notch defense. And they didn't come out just with a win. It was a decisive second-half performance, not a 16-13,
right,
white knuckler. They were decisive in the second half, and I think that means something.
So, Mark, I've got some trusty numbers to kind of back up your assertion because you and I, we both love our data. If you don't mind me reading these right off my phone here. Total yards gained and given ratio so far this season by opponent for Wisconsin in 3 Big Ten games, or 3 Power 5 games. Penn State, they were plus 74. Notre Dame, they were plus 70. Against Michigan, they were minus 155. Well, rushing yards gained and given so far against Power 5 teams. Penn State, plus 130 on the ground. Notre Dame, plus 69. Against Michigan, minus 69. And that's, to me, it's not just that they went up there and won. And hey, when we went up there in 2001, you're old enough to remember that game. That was fugly, okay? People turnovers, no quarterback was any good, okay? This was the worst loss I think Wisconsin had up there since like 2011 or 12. It's not easy to go in there, even if they're kind of down and maybe just a bowl eligible team, to just absolutely dominate them up front and punk them physically, and Michigan did that. So that, to me, it's the manner in which this was done. I'd have taken 13-12 and said, thank you, let's get the hell out of here. But what has me contemplating the ceiling of this team is they just went out there and played Wisconsin football with better athletes, something Michigan fans have been like, why don't we just play the way Wisconsin does, but we have better athletes, right? Well, they finally did that, and look what happened.
Penn State's a really good football team. Everybody looks for flaws. Everybody can find flaws with every football team in the nation, excluding two. And so Penn State's included in that. I know that they're not running the ball that effectively against anyone, although I heard that they didn't run the ball effectively against Indiana. I was focused on other games. They ran it for 5 yards per carry and over 200 yards. So the numbers that you just laid out is basically a different interpretation of yards per play. And yards per play, aside from turnovers, is the best indicator of who is going to win a game. And it's the best indicator of who dominated the line of scrimmage and who won the game at the point of attack. And so that means something. Penn State's one of the top 5 to 10 football teams in America, regardless of ranking right now. I believe that they're going to substantiate that ranking to a certain degree, maybe not number 3 in the country. And Notre Dame, again, they have struggled, yes, but they are a top 15 unit on both sides of the ball in the country, and Michigan outplayed Wisconsin decidedly more than those two teams outplayed Wisconsin.
So I am comfortable saying this, and see if you agree. I don't know how good this team can be, but I think we can at least say the program is where it was pre-COVID. A top 15, 16 program in the country. It might still end up 9-3 when you look at the games still on the schedule, right? At Michigan State, at Penn State, and then apparently there's a 12th game at the end of the year. I'm not aware of that. But when you look at the schedule, it still might end up 9-3. The 2019 team was 9-3, but on SP Plus, they were like 8th or something in the country because their 3 losses were Penn State, Alabama, and Ohio State. Okay, so it still might be 9-3. And so, but at the very least, I think we can say that last year has truly been proven to be an aberration. The new culture, the little things like the team not just doing the jump around, but then going over to the Wisconsin student section and doing it with them. That's just the kind of stuff buttoned down. Don't show a lot of. You just don't see a lot of that in the Harbaugh era. Frankly, it doesn't a lot of times feel like a college team. It feels like kind of a pro team, kind of Kirk Ferentz, but with better athletes. To me, at the very least, I think we're back to where we were pre-COVID. Is that safe to say?
Steve, let's dig up some of our conversations during the off season. Doesn't that sound like what I was saying?
Yeah.
So basically, my take on this team was I'm not necessarily going to be lulled into the rhetoric of it's a different vibe, a different attitude where we've turned the page and we've hit reset and all of that. I didn't discount it. I didn't not believe it. But, of course, we hear that from every team during the summer anyway. But that taken into account, I kept saying this is a 6-game under adverse circumstances, and certainly everyone had to endure it as well, but different teams responded different ways, that I wasn't necessarily counting that 6 games against Michigan. They count in the standings, but why is this team, why is this program based on recruiting, based on personnel, any different than what it was 2019 and prior to? And here we are.